thanks for joining me. So we're going to talk about Gap's reinvigoration, but let's start with sort of a snapshot of the wider brand strategy for the group. Can you sort of give us an overview of where that's at and what's going on at the moment?
Sure. Well, first, thank you for the invite here. I assume most people know who Gap is, but just sort of as a background, you know, we definitely are very happy to be here in a place where we have a lot of luxury players. But we're a company that has been around for over 60 years, 85,000 employees. We do about $15 billion of revenue. And we have 4 major brands under our house of brands, Old Navy, Banana Republic, Gap, and Athleta. But, you know, we are, you know, you mentioned the word reinvigoration. It's a word that we've sort of been playing with over the last handful of years, but more specifically, you know, in the last, 12 to 18 months. We've been a company that's been going through a transformation effort. At least that's what we sort of say. But the transformation is much more about reinvigoration. Yep. And the reason why it's reinvigoration is that for the last, if you look at our revenues 10 years ago, it was $15 billion. If you look at where it was 20 years ago, it was $15 billion. So in some way, you know, we've actually been a model of consistency, or, you know, as referred to earlier, very quiet growth. But you know, look, I think, you know, as part of this strategy, we sort of need to figure out how to do 4 things better. First, we needed to figure out how to bring a little bit more operational and financial rigor to our organization. We were a company that, you know, sometimes got lost. We spent money at times where we shouldn't be spending money. We made a lot of mistakes along the way. Our P&L got a little bit out of shape. We didn't have the cash that we sort of needed to sort of make sure that we were secure for the long term. We've addressed a lot of that stuff in the last 18 months, but that was sort of one big key. Mm-hmm. The second big key was to sort of make sure where our brands were going. And again, we are, even though we're not luxury, we are only as good as our brands. When I think about brands, it really fits into two pieces. Besides, obviously, the consumer piece, there are 2 big pieces. One, the product. I mean, we are a product company. We need to make sure that we are creating trend-right product that is meeting our consumer needs. Second, we are a company that is more than about selling clothes. And we lost a part of that along the way. And part of that is marketing. Our brand marketing was not where it needed to be. It wasn't resonating. It wasn't connected to the clothes that we were selling. And it really sort of lost sort of the connection and emotional connection that consumers were looking for. So, you know, part of our brand efforts has been really to sort of spark that up. Third, we have a platform. We are a large company, and 2 major parts of our platform are really around sort of real estate, and some of our efforts around international, which we'll speak about in a little bit. And then the last thing I'll just sort of say, all of this is underpinned about culture. Our culture was on and off. We had sort of lost passion for why we were doing the things that we were doing. And a lot of what we've been trying to do for the last 12 to 18 months is sort of reinforce for our employees, for our store consultants, why they actually work at the Gap, and really bring that inspiration back to every single thing that we do.
Thank you. That's really comprehensive. We mentioned emotional connection a couple of times there. So just to go back to the brand, because I think that's a pretty big deal. In terms of the bigger picture of that transformation, what role does branding and brand play in this whole reinvigoration?
Yeah. So I mean, I think from a brand perspective, one of the things, you know, for those that know Gap well, Gap is a brand that, you know, luckily is one that most people root for. It's something that people had some sort of historical connection with. People remember it back when they were a child, even maybe their parents wore it, and it used to be a sort of a sense of pride. And I think we sort of lost some of that along the way. But yet, at the same time, when I talk about Gap, people will always have fond memories because there was an emotional connection. It might have been your first T-shirt that you got that actually meant something. And so, or a pair of chinos or khakis that you wore to work. I mean, there's a lot of emotional history that's sort of tied into it. And I think that's sort of what we needed to sort of come back to, was sort of figure out from a brand perspective, how do we bring that emotional connection to the actual apparel itself, so that when people wear it, it represents something to them, whether it be a memory, whether it be sort of who they are, whether it's something about their characteristics. That's sort of what was important for us to sort of regain.
Yeah, I'm going to show my age here. I've got an old Gap polo shirt, light blue stripes, dark blue stripes. That was my favourite. So that's probably going back before your time at Gap, but I can definitely, that definitely resonates with me.
Yeah.
So there have been some recent hires at Gap, and they've really driven this sort of step change that we're starting to see. And one of the key pieces in the puzzle is the creative director, Zach Posen. So we're starting to see Gap be more heavily involved in some really culturally seminal moments. So for instance, at last year's Rome fashion show, you dressed Anne Hathaway. So what role is Zach having, and what impact is Zach having on your return to the cultural zeitgeist and being culturally relevant and all that sort of good stuff?
Yeah. Look, we've made a lot of key hires. I mean, over the last 12 to 18 months. I think one of them was our new CEO, Richard Dixon, who came from Mattel and was responsible for the Barbie movie, which, for those that have seen the Barbie movie, probably one of the more recent sort of key linchpins in terms of tying entertainment, culture, and product together. But the second one, was really Zach. For those that know Zach, couture designer, really, famous in his day, especially if you watch Project Runway. But one of the key things in terms of thinking about where we want to go from a product perspective was that we knew that we had lost the edge with our product. It became too basic, too essential. Companies like Uniqlo had basically out-gapped Gap by creating basics in a much more elevated fashion, in a much more novel way, even though, again, it's basically basic T-shirts. And so we needed to sort of find that little edge. And so what's been great about Zach is that he works across all four of our brands. He provides a lot of creative input on sort of how we need to think about trims a little bit differently, cuts a little bit differently, fit a little bit differently. All those things that he sort of studied and was known for at a much more elevated luxury level, and trying to bring it to the masses was really important. Because look, at the end of the day, we are a large company partly because we sell to the masses. And we are a company that is about democratization of fashion to the masses. And Zach really, again, his attitude towards sort of playing a big role in that was sort of key to his hire.
Really interesting. So, I mean, Gap is, as you mentioned, there are 4 brands in the portfolio, but Gap is the biggest in the Gap group. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of the collaborations that Gap's been involved in, some of the campaigns, and some of the other big initiatives that you guys are rolling out that are slowly making you more culturally relevant and making the brand resonate more with the customer today?
Yeah. So, I mean, we are a sort of a unique company in that our our company name is Gap Inc., but we do have 4 distinct brands. Gap, of course, is our one that, really is about celebrating originality, entrepreneurship, innovation. It's one that is sort of tied with kind of cultural conversations. But in terms of sort of where we are with like collaborations and so forth, I think there's 2 pieces to that. I think number one, we recognize that we are a household name, but we also need to figure out the right partnerships to sort of elevate and make something where 1 + 1 = 3. Nikolai mentioned earlier, back in 2007, we had a relationship between Gap and Ami. But in the last year, we've really sort of re-sparked some of our partnerships up and collaborations up. We did a partnership with Douyin. We did a partnership with Coke Gaia. We did a partnership with Mad Happy. I think in 2025, you'll see much more. Again, the focus there is not necessarily to generate a lot of revenues per se, but a lot of it is really brand relevance. It's really about sort of bringing brand heat and creating buzz within sort of both the younger generation as well as sort of the older generation as well.
Yeah. So you mentioned the younger generation, and they're coming into power. They're the ones that are going to be spending more, and even as we speak, they're influencing spend, even if they're not directly the ones making that spend themselves. And you guys have done some really innovative, avant-garde things with the younger generation to drive that relevance and to drive that engagement. Can you touch on that a little bit as well, please?
Sure. Just from a sizing perspective, even though, again, Gap is mass, we are the number 2 apparel vendor in the U.S. We're also the number 1 kids and baby apparel vendor in the U.S., partly because we have 2,000 stores in the U.S., partly because of our online presence. But in terms of sort of reconnecting with the youth, I think there's sort of 2 or 3 things that we've sort of been playing with. I think number one, just from a very practical perspective, as mentioned earlier, our marketing had sort of just gone away, right? And what we were known for, if you remember Gap in the back in the day, was when Madonna used to do a big dance on our commercials. It used to be something where famous artists like Lenny Kravitz would do campaigns with us. And so we were known for entertainment, music, cultural relevance, figuring out sort of the new artists before they really broke out. We just had lost it. So in the last year, if you've sort of been paying attention to some of our campaigns, we've really tried to reinfuse it with sort of that same spirit. We did sort of a partnership with Tyla, prior to her winning a bunch of awards. We did it one recently over the summer with Troye Sivan, which talks to sort of that Gen Z crowd. And then even in the fall, winter, we did a campaign that was around the music of Janet Jackson. So while, again, not necessarily contemporary, there's sort of a nostalgia, yet sort of hip feeling, because what old seems to be new today in many regards. And so I think a lot of what we're doing with sort of marketing and social media has sort of, really sort of sparked an interest where even people now sort of say, oh, I saw your commercial. Oh, I saw something about Gap. It looked pretty interesting. I saw that collaboration with Anne Hathaway. I saw what Zach Posen did at the Met Gala. Yeah. All these little things, while they seem like small, they all sort of tell a better narrative about where we're going as a brand and starting to show signs of growth because of it.
Fascinating. Thank you. So we're in Riyadh, so we appreciate everyone's hospitality here. Even though Gap's 80% of your revenues come from the US and domestic, obviously you're in several countries internationally. Can you talk to us about the 4 brands' perspective on global business, but also the group's perspective?
Yeah. So look, I think right now international represents, call it, 20% of our total retail sales. And if you look at our peers, some of them are at 50%. And so we are behind. We're behind for a lot of reasons that we can probably spend a lot of time against. But one of my sort of priorities in 25, 26, and 27 is to really expand internationally. And I think when I think about how we do it, there's a few big things that sort of come to mind. And I think this sort of conference has sort of reinforced some of that. I think number one, we recognize that we're not necessarily scaled internationally. Mm-hmm. We have to find the right partners. There's a lot of things about finding the right partners, but part of that for me has been on this trip, meeting a handful of them eye to eye and really sort of figuring out, are we really going to do business together? Yeah. Can I trust you? Is there sort of a not just sort of a common shared values, but really sort of an approach of how we're going to go after the consumer in a way that's both natural, authentic to sort of what our brand is. We've done it, worldwide, as you mentioned, with Gap. We're in about 70 countries. We have about 2,000 points of distribution. I think our other 3 brands have a lot of opportunity as well.
Absolutely.
Old Navy is actually our largest brand as an organization. It is certainly well known in that lower to middle market within the United States. I think there's a lot of translation that you start to see globally. Banana Republic is a brand that we've sort of repositioned in the last 12 to 18 months around really accessible luxury, a modern explorer look. I think, especially as I sort of spent some time in Dubai and now here in Riyadh, I think there's sort of an applicability to that, especially here in the Middle East, that could be, quite interesting. And then, I've heard a lot of conversation about, the power of women here in Riyadh specifically. And our last brand, Athleta, is a brand that basically, its tagline is about the power of she. And so what we do from an athleisure perspective, in this specific market, again, I see a lot of very unique opportunity. But I think first and foremost, it's really figuring out which markets do we, really want to play in, how will our brands sort of be represented in these markets, and then really about execution from there.
Interesting, thank you. So specifically, as I say, we're in Riyadh. What is it that has attracted you to the Middle East, and what's the group's specific interest in the region?
Yeah. I mean, look, I think from a Middle East perspective, the size of the market obviously is interesting. A lot of the growth statistics that the gentleman who talked about, from the tourism board, talked about was just, mind-blowing in terms of you think about it. And even in Dubai, Dubai Mall, the amount of visitors they had, the growth they had even in the last 12 months is quite significant. So purely just from a statistical perspective, there's something there. I think there's also something unique about sort of the expanding sort of younger demographic in this region. And if you sort of think about where brands need to go, sure, from an older consumer perspective, especially those that love your brand, you want them to love you more. For those that we had lost, you want them to love you back in some sort of way. But there's still this really big young demographic that Gap was known for that we still need to sort of figure out is the one that you want them to sort of fall in love with you. And I think that here in the Middle East, if you sort of figure out the right way to do it at the right time, you have an opportunity to sort of be a first to market of sorts and really sort of establish your brand in a very unique way. And so that's sort of my goal here for this last week. And I'm very optimistic about sort of what we can do here in this market.
Perfect. Well, look, hopefully we've been able to help with that and contribute to that in some small way. Like you say, there's a whole nother conversation around how much growth there is and how much opportunity there is for Gap, both globally and specifically here in the region. And we could spend all day talking. It's been a fascinating conversation, but I think we've got time for one more question. And I'll go back to something you mentioned earlier. Obviously, we know Richard well from his time at Mattel, and now he's at the helm at Gap, and he's really driving some outstanding results. And it seems as though he's outstanding storyteller. As you mentioned, the Barbie movie. So now that storytelling is something that he's really brought to the group and as part of his DNA, how do you see that bearing itself out over the course of the next 12, 18 months as part of this wider brand reinvigoration?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think from a just a broader company perspective, and especially with Richard now, as CEO, he has routinely talked about fashion is entertainment. And in many ways, it really is, right? And what you wear and the storytelling that sort of is imbued upon it needs to be part of the DNA of all of our employees and sort of how we act and how we actually communicate to our consumer. Certainly, he's very known for marketing and PR and buzz, and I think that's sort of one of the reasons why Gap has seen such tremendous success over the last 12 to 18 months. I will say, though, that one of the things that Richard also maybe doesn't get as much credit for is sort of recognizing that retail is really detail. There is so much about what we do that is about just execution and flawless execution on an every single day basis that, again, we as a company lost for a period of time. It's paying attention to sort of the consumer details of how they're really responding to your brand, whether that be some of the stuff that people talked about in terms of NPS and key metrics, but also just really monitoring sort of how they're really sort of experiencing your brand in the stores, what are they gravitating toward, the visual merchandising, all those things that we lost. And I think what you've seen if you've been to a Gap store recently, especially those that have been able to go to New York, I sort of welcome you to sort of see some of the new evolution of our brand in our stores. Again, we're trying to pay attention just to those extra little details because that could be the difference of why a consumer connects with you or basically chooses another brand. And those are the things that we're getting better at each and every single day.
I think that's a fitting end. So, I think all of us should be trying to get better at something each and every single day. But like I say, this is a fascinating conversation. I could speak to you all day, but we're going to wrap up here. So thank you very much, Eric.